Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C. at the offices of American Defense International, one of the leading defense and aerospace lobbying firms in Washington, to talk to the president and CEO, Michael Herson, a good friend of mine. Michael, a historic election that we've seen, like a lot of midterm elections, the party in power finds itself out of power. We saw that in '96, saw it again in 2010 with President Obama, and Republicans have made those gains, winning the White House, obviously in 16. Talk to us about this dynamic shift. You know, Adam Smith is going to replace Mac Thornberry as chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, assuming there are no other competitors for that. I think that's pretty assured. Jim Cooper, we're going to see take over on space. But both of these have great relationships, minority-majority. Adam Smith and Mac Thornberry were very, very aligned on a lot of issues. Even though they disagreed on some fundamental things, they still had a very bipartisan relationship. Talk to us a little bit about what this change is going to mean for defense and aerospace, do you think?
Well, I think you answered part of the question for me already. I think we're very fortunate that Mac Thornberry and Adam Smith have had a very close working personal relationship for a long period of time. And they're both cut out of a very similar cloth. They're both, well, I like to say, intellectually honest. And they're both very accessible. So I think, on the macro level, we're going to see very few changes. I think that, there are some differences in opinion on some policy issues like low-yield nuclear weapons and a few other issues like that. But I think when you look at the top line in defense spending as a whole, defense spending was coming down regardless of who controlled the House. As we see, the Pentagon was preparing a budget for $733 billion, and now the president said that he wanted to cut defense spending, so they're working on another budget at $700 billion. So really, President Trump agrees with Adam Smith when Adam Smith says that 716 really isn't the right number. So we knew it was going to come down regardless. What the number is we really don't know. And I think what we're probably going to see is the president's budget come out somewhere between 700 to 733. The Senate probably marking to the number that the president gives, since the Senate is still controlled by the Republicans. And the House will mark to a different number. And then we'll have to wait and see where we are at the end of the year if they're able to come to a budget deal in order to conference the two bills.
How do you do talk to leadership on both sides of the aisle on a continuous basis? There is a little bit of a concern, or at least a talking point, certainly on the Republican side. Okay, well, now you're going to have Democrats with all of their social priorities take money away from defense. If you listen to Nancy Pelosi's rhetoric, which we were discussing that unusual series of tweets from the president this morning, sort of lauding Nancy Pelosi, or setting the foundation to be able to run against her in 2020, certainly. But this perception that folks were voting on health care, they were voting for Medicare expansion, or at least supporting Obamacare. I mean, there are people who did change their party based on, hey, we want coverage of pre-existing conditions, for example, and a whole bunch of other things. And so this concern that social spending is going to put pressure on defense. How do you think that that's going to play out in the real world, where both parties sort of agree that there needs to be more steady military investment?
Well, I think it's probably going to play out the way it played out during the last budget deal, where in order to get the increased domestic discretionary spending, the Democrats had to agree to increase defense spending. And in order for the Republicans to get the increased defense spending, they had to agree to the increase in non-defense domestic discretionary spending. I think, Americans want a lot of things, they just don't want to pay for them. So, and the party in power never seems to care about the deficit. So I think you'll hear the Republicans start talking a lot about the deficit again. But I think we've seen that history will tell us that they'll continue to kick the can down the road. And where there will be some pressure on defense spending, I still think the number should be a pretty big number. And again, I think we'll see the increases on the non-defense domestic discretionary as well.
That line was very Adam Smithian. Americans want everything, and they just don't want to pay for it. You didn't have quite the delivery that Representative Smith has, this unique delivery. Is it? You represent a lot of firms, a lot of products. At the end of the day, is it clear to see who are going to be winners and losers in this calculus? I know that everybody's working very, very hard, and you're working very hard to make sure the right outcomes happen for your clients. But I mean, is there a sense on who's going to be winners or losers, or is this $16 billion or $33 billion decrement going to be salami sliced, which is sort of more the historic thing, as opposed to trade-offs? Because there are some folks in the department who are urging, hey, look, this is a great opportunity. Let's make some big trade-offs. Let's jettison stuff that we may not need for the future. How do you think that's going to play out?
Well, I think it's very early, but I think it's most likely going to pay out in cuts in modernization. So I think everybody in that case is a winner, and everybody in that case is also a loser. We've seen in the past that readiness is what suffered. But I think that you see, between Adam Smith and between Mac Thornberry, a recognition that we need to maintain our readiness. It's been a serious problem. We're getting a lot less flight hours, a lot less training, and that's always been America's edge, is that we had the best equipped and best trained force, and we need to be able to keep that even if we're outnumbered. So I think that it really is going to be on the modernization side that we're going to see the problems.
Which is what Pat Shanahan has said, right? That we're likely going to delve into the modernization accounts. But there you think salami slice is more likely than big jettisons?
Yes, I do. I think it's going to go back to the way we've been looking at things. 2 years of increased defense spending is not going to solve all the problems that we've brought upon ourselves over the last 8 years. But I think we're going to continue to see how can we lengthen the life of our existing platforms as long as we can and replace the ones that really desperately need to be replaced.
At the risk of forcing you to gaze into your crystal ball, but I mean, where do you think the consensus is on spending beyond beyond the 2020 budget? Because there was this, and there's a little bit of frustration, right? Because some folks at the White House and the administration will point out this was not a surprise to anybody in the Pentagon. Mulvaney has been talking about flat to down in coming years. So the Pentagon did what the Pentagon always does, which is look at the more optimistic scenario and, hey, if we can try to get more money, and this is the trajectory we should be on. What do you think that trajectory looks like? Does it go to, say, 716 or something like that and flatten, or do you see that this is a hump and then we start going down? Because there are a lot of folks who will argue that the defense budget, despite the Budget Control Act, was consistently going, rising over the past 10 years.
Yeah, well, I think you're correct, and we've talked about this before, that even though the defense budget has been rising, it was not at the levels of the Obama baseline initially projected before the BCA was put into effect. I think, look, they're going to have to make some really tough choices, and that's a hard thing for them to do because, as you know, the personnel costs continue to eat up a bigger portion of the budget, and that's something that Congress has not wanted to address. So if it's not going to come out of the personnel side, things are going to have to come out of the readiness side, on the research side, or on the procurement side. And right now, I don't think there really is any consensus on that. And I think the numbers really, unfortunately, tend to be made-up numbers. Instead of figuring out what's the threat, what forces and capability do we need to meet the threat, and then what's that cost, we really do it in a backwards way. But Adam Smith has been very thoughtful on that, and he has talked about what threats do we really need to meet. I think that he is rightfully getting a little tired of endless hearings about all the things that we can't do. And I think he's got to take a look and see what we can do. But that will force some very tough choices because if we're going to start giving away missions, I think there will be pressure to give away the humanitarian mission because that's not a warfighting mission. Right. And I think that there'll be some fight on the partisanship side of that discussion.
And let me ask you one last question on Space Force. Big topic of conversation. I know you've got space companies in your portfolio, among them SpaceX. But talk to us a little bit about how this dynamic is going to go. Ranking Member Smith, I should just say that because there are only limited number of opportunities to say that. Has been pretty clear that he thought, maybe there's, obviously there should be a greater focus on space, but I don't think he's been a fan of Space Force, and he's made that clear. Jim Cooper has been a little bit more in line with his chairman about saying, hey, there are, maybe Space Corps or something like that. How do you think this issue is going to play out? Or in an era of flattening and potentially declining budgets, are folks going to say, hey, look, that's money that we just don't have to spend right now, and let's focus more on sort of classical acquisition and increase, standing up a new Space Command, for example?
I think Space Force, or whatever we tend to call it, is something that's going to be inevitable. So whether it happens now or it happens several years from now, it's something that's going to happen. I think we're very lucky to live in the time that we live, that we see the birth of all these different space companies. Not only SpaceX, but Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, and all these companies are coming out and bringing ingenuity to something that desperately needs it, and bringing private capital and not just relying on government capital. And we see our adversaries also looking to spend a lot more money and time on space and space weapons. So I think that Adam Smith was initially a supporter of Space Force. I think he's looking at the cost and concerned about it, and rightfully so. Mac Thornberry is a strong supporter of it. The president's supportive of it. So I think that they're going to figure out, they're going to come to a middle ground. And like I said, I think it is nothing, it's inevitable. I think the genie's out of the bottle, and at some point we're going to end up seeing a Space Force.
Are there any other committee leadership changes on the House side? I was going to ask you. Obviously, Adam Schiff, becomes chairman of the Intelligence Community, replacing Devin Nunes. Foreign Affairs. I mean, what are some of the other changes? If you can just give us sort of a nutshell on a couple of the other committee chairmanships and what they may mean, because obviously Foreign Affairs matters and a couple of other committees.
Sure. Well, Elliot Engel will be the new chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and again, I think he's cut out of a similar cloth. Very intellectually honest, and works very well with the Republicans. He and Ed Royce, who's the outgoing chairman and who also didn't run for re-election, have worked very well together. I think the new ranking member will be either Mike McCall or Joe Wilson, and I think that tradition will continue. And I think Elliot Ennigal's a very, very thoughtful guy. Benny Thompson will be the new chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. It's another committee that plays very much in our space as well. So I think we're very lucky because we have a sense of predictability as to what's going to go on.
And appropriations and HAC-D?
So Pete Visklosky will be the chairman of Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, and Nita Lowy is expected to be the chair of the full committee.
Wow. Michael Herson, President and CEO here at American Defense International. Thanks very much. It's always a pleasure.
Great.
And look forward to talking to you again once everybody is in position so that you can give them a report card.
I'm looking forward to it, too. Thank you.